So let's be honest, a little bit of clickbaitiness with the thumbnail, because I'm going to say right now that the conversation of Demarcus Cousins being a positive or a negative fit for this Pelicans team, it's probably a positive, let's be honest here, because when you have him and Anthony Davis up front, just the size that those two have and the dominance they can have on the boards, scoring inside, and the fact that Demarcus Cousins can just go off for 40 points any night, on top of what Anthony Davis can do, is pretty nuts. And while they took a little bit this regular season, to figure it out together, they were definitely starting to get it rolling. They won like 7 or 8 games in a row. They beat the Rockets right in the middle of the Rockets' crazy run. The Pelicans were starting to figure it out. Then DeMarcus Cousins goes down, and it seemed like all was lost. They signed Nikola Mirotic. They move Anthony Davis to center. That unlocks a super defensive lineup, which is pretty much when you move AD to center, the team just gets way better on defense. It happened last year as well. And now they are in the second round after sweeping the Trailblazers, and I think it's been a thing that's kind of crept up a little bit on the internet. Are the Pelicans better without DeMarcus Cousins? I mean, I think that's kind of unfair to Boogie, because they had to make the Mirotic addition, which I think kind of unlocked this new Pelicans team, because him next to Anthony Davis, that's a pretty ideal front court. You know, you have the shooter who can make his own shots, create his own shots occasionally, and you have the rim-rolling defensive nightmare at the 5, and it just kind of works out, you know. And Mirotic actually is maybe underrated on defense. He moves pretty okay for a power forward who doesn't have the most athleticism in the world. And that's just a little more immediate of a fit to me than having 2 big guys in today's NBA. So I think the question really is, because I do think the Pelicans will re-sign DeMarcus, and I think they should on a conservative contract given his Achilles injury. The question is, what's going to happen? What's this team going to be looking like next season? Well, I think you would start games with Anthony Davis and DeMarcus Cousins, of course. Now, whether Boogie can be back for the beginning of next year and all that stuff does matter. Maybe he'll be back, but he won't totally be himself. Maybe he'll have to be on a minutes restriction. I don't really know. But I have to assume once everybody's good to go, you have Anthony Davis and you have DeMarcus Cousins up front, and those two can hopefully continue where they left off at before DeMarcus was injured, where they were just beating teams with just making tough shots. I mean, when you have 2 guys who can just put up those point totals and then Anthony Davis can do his thing on defense, that's huge, you know? And then you just hope that Boogie can sustain himself enough defensively. There is a fear that he could have a decline on defense because of this injury, and, well, let's be honest, he doesn't have much more of a decline to go before he's a pretty bad defensive 5, but you got to assume the offense is still going to be really good, and hopefully the defense just won't be too bad with him. Because I do think he was improving this previous season. I feel like he started off well, then he kind of sunk into his old habits, and then he kind of crept back up to being a little better on defense before he got hurt. So there's that for you. But then you add Mirotic into the fold, and I think you can still kind of have the best of both worlds, honestly, where you can have AD and DeMarcus being physical as hell, grabbing rebounds and doing their thing, but then your go-to off the bench could be move AD to center, put Mirotic at power forward, and then you roll with that for a few minutes. I mean, I don't think it's ridiculous to think that a team can have a few different identities. The Houston Rockets are doing it this season, where they started the year with Ryan Anderson at power forward, and then maybe about midway through, they moved him to the second unit. They put PJ Tucker in at the power forward spot so they could have more switchability on defense and all that. And they're able to just kind of mix and match different lineups and make it all work, right? Like sometimes they'll have Eric Gordon out there with Harden and Chris Paul. Sometimes they'll have Mbah Moute and PJ Tucker out there for more defense. And they've been able to make it work. Now, I know that they have CP3 and Harden And when you have those two, almost anything's going to work anyway. But, like, you got Anthony Davis, you know? When you got Anthony Davis, that's going to be able to plug up a lot of maybe uncertainty that you have with your team. I guess the fear could be playing Demarcus Cousins with Mirotic, and a lot of that's just going to be about where Boogie's defense is at, just because, like I mentioned, Mirotic, I think he's an okay enough defender. He did a good job of being a part of the pick and roll scheme against the Blazers in this first round series where they swept them. But, you know, he's still not one of the better defensive fours, and then Boogie is Boogie, so that could be a problem, but you could just not play them together. There's definitely ways around that. You have small ball four options on this team with Solomon Hill and all that. And I do think Solomon Hill is actually better suited to being a power forward than he is a small forward. So there are ways I think you could, you know, use that AD and Mirotic front court, which is very good when they're together, and then still have enough defenders to help out Demarcus Cousins when you have him as your lone big man. And who knows, maybe maybe Boogie and Mirotic together could still be really good. I mean, from a shooting standpoint, that would be a very difficult lineup to deal with. And from a rebounding standpoint, Cousins takes a lot of pressure off of Mirotic as well. So there's reason to believe it would work, but the defense does still freak me out a little bit. Now, there are some other elements to this, one of which is being what is DeMarcus Cousins' contract going to be, which I touched on a little bit. I have to assume the Pelicans would not want to give him just the 5-year max because of the Achilles injury, right? We're seeing that Wesley Matthews just started to get back to what he was before the injury this season, and that was, I mean, the injury was a while ago at this point. And Boogie's a big guy, so his lack of movement might be even worse, you know? Or it might be even more detrimental. So I have to think they would probably like to give him a contract that's like a 2+1. I have to assume DeMarcus, as well as his agent, would not be a fan of that. And you have to remember that other teams would be willing to take a chance on Boogie, you know? You look at a team like the Phoenix Suns, for example, who have a lot of money. Maybe they would just say, screw it, let's go for it. We have the means to do it, and whether you think they actually should or not is a different conversation, but there's always going to be at least one team willing to go a little against the grain for something that could end up being good for them, you know? So there's that. What we could see is a contract full of incentives based around games played, minutes played, All-Star awards, All-NBA selections. If he suffers an injury related to the Achilles, does that knock his contract down a bit? It's similar to Joel Embiid's contract. The only thing with that is if that happens, then that means he probably gets more guaranteed years as a result. So it'll be very interesting. I do think he'll be back on the Pelicans because, number one, the potential of AD and Boogie is still pretty high. Number two, they were figuring it out. Number three, the Pelicans don't really have a way of acquiring other talent if they were to let him walk, because you have to assume they re-sign Rondo given how good he's been in the playoffs so far for them. Not to a ridiculous contract. I mean, he probably wouldn't cost you more than at the very most $6 or $7 million a year. But that would still take you over the salary cap, and then at that point it's like, well, what do you really do, you know? Now, they do have a mid-level, but even if you were to sign someone like a Dwayne Dedmon, let's say, with your mid-level, which actually you might not be able to do, because I believe the mid-level rule is like you have to be over the cap by the time free agency begins, and re-signing one of your own guys may complicate that. I don't know. It's weird stuff. But let's just say they were looking to sign more of a backup center, and they were going to just go the route of Anthony Davis, Nikola Mirotic, and then a backup 5 who can just assist AD, and they went with the more conservative route. I mean, I feel like that plan has a higher floor, just because you're not dealing with the potential of DeMarcus just being like 20% worse as a player. But it also has a lower ceiling as well, because if Boogie's himself, then, you know. So it'll be very interesting stuff. The other thing this team needs, and I mentioned it a little bit, is they need a small ball 4 who can really defend because, or maybe not even necessarily a small ball 4, just a power forward who can do it, right? Because if you're going to have those times when Demarcus Cousins is at center, if I'm right in that he and Mirotic just may not be good enough defensively, which I could be wrong on, that's totally possible, but if that's going to be a thing, then, having a 4 who can help out would be good. I do believe that when Demarcus Cousins played with Dante Cunningham, who's of course no longer on the team, but when he played with him this season, they were actually a pretty good defensive team. So finding a guy like that, they do have Solomon Hill, who I don't think is a perfect selection, but who knows? They'd have to use whatever exception that they have to find that type of a guy. I mean, I know Trevor Ariza is going to potentially be a free agent this offseason. Someone like that. Actually, Mba Mute is also a free agent. He could fit the bill there as well. I think you see what I'm getting at, But yeah, it's a very interesting decision to make, Once again, I think the ceiling of AD and Boogie together is still the highest option of all these, but it may also have the lowest floor because of his injury, so it's going to be something. We'll see what the Pelicans do. And then new podcast in the description. I finally accepted the fact that playoff Rondo is a real thing, and he's a way better player than regular season Rondo. So I talk about that, and then I give my first impressions about 4 or 5 hours in on God of War, which just dropped.